Well, hello, New Zealand. Welcome to Political Playback. Look, I'm just going to jump straight in and introduce the man who is not Bob. It's Brendan Malone. Lovely to have you along, Brendan.
I don't know, is that an insult or is that a good thing that I'm not Bob? I'll leave that to the viewers.
That's right. Put that as a poll for tonight. No, Bob is away having deserved time off, and though he's probably watching this online somewhere, but we have Brendan Malone along. Hopefully he's known to many of the viewers here. He's a cultural commentator, a real voice in the wilderness on a number of issues, including in the space of life. And also incredibly sartorial. I can never compete, so I just don't bother. But also you're running something called Activate, which you're going to tell us a little bit more about at the end.
Oh, indeed I am. And we've got a big youth camp coming up, actually, almost full. Only a couple of spaces left, so there's hope. There's hope on the horizon.
This is good to know. Look, there's no shortage of topics. Tonight, Brendan and I were talking before we coming on live, as we are here. There's no shortage of topics, and we'll see if we can fit most in before 6 o'clock. Just a reminder to all our viewers and listeners, this is a live show. Brendan and I are in the studio live. We can take your comments from the Family First Facebook page and from Family First's YouTube channel. And because of that, I can actually bring them, hopefully this works, I can bring them, oh no, they're coming from the wrong one. Isn't that just no, they're coming from the wrong one. Anyway, I can see your live comments. So I can see from everyone from Fine Weather to Murray to Jackie. So if you've got comments, I'll be able to see them, and we can put those comments, questions and thoughts to myself and Brendan as things go along. So Brendan, look, the first topic, which has only just come up in the last few hours, is a recent poll. This one's from, paid for by the Taxpayer Union, so they'll be using Courier Research. And it seems for the first time, according to this, Labour is now ahead of National. It's only by a point or so, and we've got a little bit more detail for people here. Not quite enough if we add all the numbers for the centre-left to govern necessarily, but I mean, your impressions on what we're seeing with the percentages here?
I think this is a bit of a few things, I suppose. It's a bit of an outlier, I think, and because we've had a poll just, a few days ago showing that it's not this way at all. So I think what we're seeing is this sort of, really what we're seeing is not so much how do you intend to vote in an election, but in this present moment when we have phoned you, how do you feel about the government? And that can vary wildly, I think, from day to day, depending on what's going on. I look at things like ACT being so high, I'm not so sure about. I look at the margin between the two parties, and I think there's just not much in it. I don't think there would be anything reliable here. And one thing I would say to people is I think we are going to talk about Justinda Ardern's book tonight, but one of the things she mentioned in her book was in the lead up to that first election in 2017, she quoted a poll that had both parties neck and neck. And in actual fact, that wasn't the election night result at all. It wasn't even close. So it's a funny thing, really. I think they're really surveying here, and particularly there's so much polling going on. What is your mood in this moment?
Exactly right. And I'm sorry that for some reason you're Bob McCoskey at the moment. There's more buttons here than I could poke a stick at. So we'll sort this in a moment.
That's all right.
Clearly not Bob. But look, I myself am not going to read into it too much. I think don't get me wrong, I think the coalition should be worried. National should be worried. You know, they've just launched the budget. That's their big moment. Well, as I say, it's meant to be the big moment, and yet.
But in saying that, Simon, like if remember the hoo-ha about the pay equity stuff, and they really did almost get tanked there. But clearly, so I'd be okay coming out of it with such a close margin. You'd think they'd be a lot further behind if the rug was pulled out from under them on the budget.
You would hope so. But. We'll see. I mean, look, polls are polls, and even, jumping back here, there's not even a percent in it. And so, margins of errors and everything. But, for what it's worth, I think they'll be nervous. It's not going quite as strongly. Interestingly, we haven't actually got the information up for you here, but Winston, as in Peters, is the only party leader who has a net favourability. All the other leaders, be it Luxon or Hipkins, are in the negatives. Winston's actually a positive. I mean, would something like that surprise you?
Oh, it doesn't at all, actually. I think he's played a very astute game this time, and I'm kind of not surprised. He's always been known as a wily campaigner, but his ground game, I said the other night on Bob's panel show, that his ground game is well ahead of everyone else at the moment. He's out there campaigning and has been for quite some time. And not just that, but I feel maybe this time he might have learnt from the previous relationship he had with the Ardern government in 2017, which is a very similar sort of closeness. And I can't help but sense that maybe he learnt about how to avoid being sort of put in second place and being pushed to the back of the bus sort of thing. He's actually managed to maintain himself and navigate that, I think, a lot better this time. So for whatever reason, I think I'm not really surprised, though, by that.
Well, speaking of surprise, which is a terrible segue into something that's actually quite serious, you and I, again, were talking about this before we came on air. It came out this morning, quite distressing in and of itself, and actually quite a distressing topic, because we're talking the tragic death of a teenager. Do you want to talk our viewers and listeners through what's been happening here? I mean, it's just so upsetting and angry, and at so many levels.
Yeah, it is. It really is. Reading through this, first of all, it's actually kind of a refreshing thing to see some long form, investigative type journalism again. That's relatively good, what's in this article and what it exposes. But basically what you've got here is a situation where a young girl who was battling with anorexia then finds her way into the system, and she then, after what sounds like a bit of a messy breakup, typical when you have a youthful boyfriend-girlfriend relationship that breaks up, she now begins to claim that she's actually a male, not a female. And so what happens then is all of a sudden the system wraps around, and a whole lot of people in the system wrap around this thing and treat it like the primary issue here is her gender dysphoria, her confusion about her sex. And they treat, it seems to be, based on what the reporting indicates, that the actual eating disorder was treated as a secondary thing, even though they had a psychiatrist saying that I think she is using the question of gender identity as a way of actually trying to mask the anorexia and, to continue not to eat. And basically the parents then, and you can read through the article, it's quite a lengthy article, but the way in which they were treated, it does seem pretty clear that's exactly what happened. And sadly, she clearly was not getting the proper support she needed. There was a court order that was removed, and then she goes into like a motel type, I guess semi-care / motel type living arrangement, and clearly she's just eating less and less. And finally, I would imagine, sadly, her heart must have just given out or something like that. And what was even more tragic was it was several days before anybody even discovered her having died. And lest anybody be tempted to judge the parents in this situation, it's very clear that she pushed them away, and they actually, I think they acted very prudently to try and do whatever they could to maintain the relationship and gently try and get back into a relationship with her. So that's why they didn't initially know that she had died. It's not like they'd abandoned her or anything. But yeah, when you read through this and the way in which the parents were undermined by the system at several stages, including the school, at one point, the parents said, we don't want her wearing a boy's uniform, and the school basically told the parents that they were being silly and that they actually went and got her a uniform. They overstepped the line big time there. And there's others as well. It's absolutely right. It's absolutely tragic that as someone has so young should not have died in this way. And it's also really, really infuriating. As a parent, I've got 4 girls myself, and I was angry when I finished this article, particularly when you get to the litany of responses from the various government agencies and social services, and they all say exactly the same thing. We feel really sorry for the parents, but we can't comment on an ongoing issue. And it's like all of a sudden, all care and no responsibility, and the parents are the ones left to grieve and deal with a truly horrific tragedy.
It is. I mean, and look, thank you for that summary. And if people want to jump onto the likes of Radio New Zealand, that's where I've sourced this image from. To me, the gender ideology and transgenderism in particular, that ideology trumped everything else. It's what actually distanced the child from their parents, or rather the public servants. All of these people were meant to care for the child. Isolated the parents from their own child because the parents weren't going to fully embrace the child's supposed new identity, which of course the article itself says the child renounced in the end. I mean, the child was autistic and anorexic. So the parents were pushed out. I would argue from what I've read is that everyone responsible for her, parents aside, was so obsessed on the gender identity elements, they ignored the anorexia. And as the headline says, she starved to death.
Well, it's what's for me, like, that's already tragic enough, but to add tragedy to tragedy, the reason this whole problem manifested of the eating disorder was because she'd been the victim of sexual abuse at the hands of a classmate in primary school. And the therapist had warned puberty is a time when this can return in a way that's not healthy. And it's exactly what happened. And it's just, it's an epic tragedy. And you know what else I see in this, Simon? I see the fingerprints of liberalism all over this, because liberalism refuses to recognize that you are actually part of a prior community, the family. And the whole way through, it's acting as if who are these two weird people calling themselves mum and dad? What would they know? They love that child and they know that child more intimately than anybody else involved. Despite their efforts, their best efforts at care, no one can love and know a child as well as a loving parent can. And that's what has been totally neglected here. And that's very typical of liberalism, which just sees the child as its own sort of radical, autonomous, self-choosing individual, rather than actually a member of a pre-existing and obviously the most important of all communities, the family.
And you and I, I'm sure, along with Bob and actually the whole Family First crew and the work that you lead, the family is important, that parental relationship with a child. And I mean, we could spend the entire show discussing this, but we won't. But the more and more now as the state tries to actually break those bonds. I mean, this is an absolute tragic example of it, where the state, in effect, broke the relationship between parent and child and is now completely and utterly stuffed it up. But you see it in so many ways now, and it's just deeply problematic. But we've been told before, if you want to undermine society, break down the family, and that's exactly what we seem to be seeing. Well,
that's and what's even worse here. I mean, you're right. You reminded me of a quote actually by the former Catholic Pope John Paul II. He said, as goes the family, so goes society. But what's even more obscene about this is the psychiatrist actually warned and said, like, this is an expert. Remember, trust the experts. Here's an expert saying, I think this young girl is actually claiming a masculine gender so she can hide and not have to actually explain why her body is being distorted by the eating disorder. So it becomes a masking tool or technique. And the expert was warning about this, but no one listened, obviously.
Well, part of it, I would argue, is this new conversion therapy legislation as well. It gets very, very difficult, particularly in this gender ideology space, to actually speak up and say, well, hold on a moment, there could be an issue. All you can do is affirm and affirm. But I think the award for me, and we'll wrap up on this one, was a comment not in the comments today from our wonderful viewers. I fixed the system. We've got it working now, and Brendan is no longer Bob. But someone on my social media said, well, actually, parents just have to accept and love the child exactly as they are. But I thought it was the most idiotic comment of the day, because, of course, they were referencing the gender ideology of the child. And you're going, really? So would you apply that to the child's anorexia? Of course we wouldn't. We wouldn't accept that. You do all you can. It's just mind-boggling ignorance. And sadly, this little one's now dead. It's just beyond tragic.
It also assumes, Simon, that these parents didn't know actually what they're doing. And when you read the full article, it's absolutely clear that there's a good reason why they wouldn't actually go down that road, because they could see it would actually endanger their child, and that's exactly what happened. And so to sort of turn around and say, well, they should just accept the child as they are, that wouldn't have actually ended up any different to how this tragic story unfolded.
No, exactly right. And we're still here, people. I'm just putting up some text actually from the article, which, I'll just give you a moment to read. But I think that's a really good point. It sounds to me, I mean, kudos actually to the parents who've actually released this story. I mean, how tragic is the whole situation in and of itself? They must be grieving and mourning deeply, but actually good on them, I think, going to the media and talking about it. So hopefully this is not repeated. But on the other side too is exactly what you just said. I mean, they clearly needed help, and it failed. Yeah.
Managerialism at the end of the day. And you see that at the end of the article. It's just a litany. It's like 4 or 5 or might have been 6 different social agencies, then government departments that are all just now basically trying to wash their hands of it. There's just no accountability in it, which is, that's why you actually support and nurture families. You don't insert the state into them.
Well, isn't it a classic case of when we do try to break away, pervert or change a system, which is good in this case, family, it becomes this complicated system of managers. It's the same, and again, we could go down a massive tangent here. I know you're big into the good, the profound, the beautiful, but when we step away from good morals or good virtues in society and try to replace it with laws and regulations and conduct and consent training, it ends up this mind-boggling, complicated system. And you go, just return to good morals.
That's right. It's not rocket science.
No, speaking of not rocket science, sorry, just to upset everybody, I should have put a trigger warning on this. Why? I think Bob might have touched on this last week, but I know that someone has read the book.
My secret's out.
That's right. If you don't know, guys, Brendan does something called The Dispatches. He's also on Substack as Bob and I are, so do look up his work there. I'll get Brendan to comment on the moment, seeing he's read it. But there's just massive endorsements going on at the moment. Oprah, everyone fawning over Justinda's book. And then we get this little gem. I'm just going to play a short video. And then I'll get your comment on, the book itself, but what's happening, Brendan.
Or we have the option of blaming others, of saying that the cause of the insecurity you feel or the financial insecurity you feel is this group or this group. And that is a quick and easy way to do politics. Incite fear. It's the oldest trick in the book, but it is the most harmful and the most damaging. And I talk openly about the alternatives because they exist. There are leaders who champion empathetic leadership, who actually want to solve the problems. But what we see a spotlight more often is that alternative. And I wish so much that we can turn towards those more optimistic, hopeful, and inclusive responses to problems, rather than the fear that we see people reach to.
Am I just jaded and cynical that Justinda has absolutely no self-reflection? I mean, help me out here. Help us all out here, Brendan.
Well, as I said to my listeners when I did 2 reviews of the book, actually. I started it last week, and I was determined I wasn't going to pay for it. So I didn't steal it or anything. But what I did was I have both Audible for books on the go, and I obviously buy books, and I didn't want to use either of those. So I checked my Spotify account, and it includes audiobooks now, and there it was. So I didn't have to pay anything extra. So I actually had Justinda read it to me, and there's a good reason for that. Number one is I think that I wanted to actually get a really good sense of what she intended. And in a situation like this, the author's inflection and their tone is very present because they're reading you their own work. And generally that's quite a good and helpful thing. And so I was expecting maybe there'd be something a bit deeper. Maybe there would be a bit more of an explanation of a leadership philosophy. There's just none of that. It is just literally her recounting of key events. And there's also a lot that's missing. One thing that I really saw as quite noticeable was the absence. I don't remember a single reference in any part of the book to the fact that she worked for Tony Blair and his government. Now that doesn't suit the narrative because he was partnering with George Bush on the war for oil, and that's not kind, and that was fear-driven, and so that doesn't look so good. So you don't talk about it. The way other things are presented are clearly spun in a narrative direction that is actually misleading in places, and on top of that, it's also contradictory. Like she talks a lot about kindness in the book, but then when she gets to talking about David Cunliffe, oh boy, there's not much kindness there, and even worse for David Seymour. She talks, for example, about David Seymour. She literally, this is almost verbatim quote, where she says he wanders around like he wants to rule the world or control the world. And I thought, gosh, that's projection, isn't it? Yeah. And then at another point, she said, I couldn't help but sense that he was more interested in using his question time in Parliament to create self-promoting social media videos. And I thought, this is not kind, and B, it feels a little bit like projection. So I've long said, actually, Simon, that I think Seymour is the dark Ardern. They're a yin and a yang, those two, just in very different ideological directions, which is maybe why she's so frustrated by him. But yeah, as I said, it's contradictory. And most notably, though, there was just nothing of any depth or note there. Like, if you're reading this thinking, I'm going to find out some important inside information, or I'm going to get a sense of what she believes philosophically, you will still, at the end of this, not be any clearer. And that in and of itself is kind of interesting as a phenomenon, a social phenomenon. The most interesting bits of the book to me actually were the one or two moments where she talked about her Mormonism and leaving the Mormon religion. And effectively what's clear in the book is, she doesn't say this, but when you read what she's saying, she effectively traded the religion of Mormonism for the religion of progressive politics. And one thing that really cemented that for me was when she talks about Harry Duynhoven, a former Labour great who actually gave her start. But then she talks about after that why she left Harry Duynhoven. She was working for him, and she left to work for Phil Goff. And she recounts this conversation she had with Phil Goff, where she said that the two first big reasons were that Harry Duynhoven, despite the fact that he was known for helping the poor and working with the vulnerable people in his electorate, he's a Catholic, and he voted against prostitution, and he voted against civil unions. And those were the two first primary reasons why she left. So progressivism was the religion of the day, not even the sort of the care for the poor. That came second to the progressive tenets. So yeah, fascinating, but not particularly deep.
No, look, it doesn't surprise. Look, I haven't read it, and I'm not going to read it. I a bit like Nancy Margaret's comment, I've got blood pressure. Well, actually, I don't have blood pressure issues, and I just don't want them. But it's vacuous is the word that I'd use for it. Not that I've read it, but from what they're reporting on it and what you've shared, for two reasons. One is that, again, no self-reflection. We just need to look at the state of the economy. We can mention COVID, of course, and all the things that everyone went through is the antithesis of kindness, and yet she continues to talk about this. But the other is, and it also reminds me of a lot of MPs when they give their valedictory speech, and it echoes for me these books. I want to read a book and I want to hear a valedictory speech about what have you learned, what are those things you deeply want to share, rather than just a recounting of what happened. And there are too many political biographies coming out now, like valedictory speeches, which just really list off, I did this, I did that. I mean, I can find that out on Wikipedia. What did you learn?
That's right, and that's the thing. I could be wrong about this, but my sense is that actually Barack Obama probably started this trend. I've more and more I'm becoming convinced that you can't even write a memoir until you're actually older in years and have a life to really look back on, where the key thing is an introspective sort of, like you've said, an examination of your own life and your actions. There is none of that. In fact, there's not even a single moment where there's an admission that maybe I didn't quite get that right. Everything is justified and everything is repainted in the light of being the best decision, because there's no other alternative is ever presented, and she doesn't ever take an introspective look at her own actions.
And nor do the Oprah Winfreys or some of the reporters here in New Zealand. I assume, and it's as much a question as a statement, they are from the Church of Woke, and so they want to push this narrative of kindness and so forth. They've got a vested interest to prolong the myth around Justinda.
Yeah, well, I think I often say to people overseas, it was a very different experience living under the leadership. And it's one thing to have the very cleverly crafted PR narrative. And look, there's no doubt she's very good at that kind of a thing. And this is utilized in the book to great effect at times. But it's a whole nother thing to actually live under that style of leadership. My sense is that there are, in places, particularly when she talks about the mosque shooting, there was a genuine earnestness and sadness there. But I think there's also, you start to get a sense for the fact that you need more than just an earnestness. And without that, there are other essential attributes that I think were missing. And part of it too, the book again reminded me, she went straight from high school into the echo chamber of politics. And you do at times get a sense, this is someone who maybe is sort of captured in that youthful moment where you think like a high schooler would, or a young university student who says, if I just say the right words often enough, it's like a spell, everyone will change, the country will change. That's not how real change happens. It's harder, It involves more suffering, more challenges, and more compromise. And you, instead of getting that sort of sense, you get the sense of a politician almost like a high school student who gives a really beautiful and empowering speech about change the world, but doesn't quite fully understand what that really means in practice. And I deliberately went into it, as I said to my readers, I didn't want to be unkind or uncharitable. I don't want to go in with that jaded thing you talked about at the beginning. So I did try to sort of just listen with an open mind and really sort of try and get a sense of where she was coming from. Sadly, the book just didn't really give me that.
No, and I think it's a growing problem actually in the Parliament in general as a younger demographic, not just by age but experience, going through a little bit like Justinda. But to be fair, there's issues in other parties as well, not about books. We won't spend too long on this, and not because it's national related, and I want to talk about the Maori Party a little bit as well. But you've got this imbroglio, is that the right word, around the press secretary of the Prime Minister, visiting prostitutes, covert filming and so forth. I suppose the question in my mind is, does this tell you anything? As I introduced you at the start, you're a cultural commentator. I mean, is this sort of not a natural consequence, but we seem to get upset about this at one level, and yet society's created can't even find the right words, Brendan. Does this surprise you? Maybe that's what I'm just trying to say.
Well, look, when I read this, what I find more interesting about this incident is what is not actually revealed or told to the public. And so part of it's a bit vague exactly what they found on his phone, for starters, and I guess we'll talk about that in a minute. But the one thing that really struck out to me is in the story is I can't help but sense that there's probably pornography addiction underlying this, actually. That's sort of something we don't really talk about. And then there's also this sort of hedonistic culture that we've created for ourselves where we've effectively said that the only sexual moral is consent. But that doesn't really make sense unless there is something sacred about the sexual act that requires us to actually ensure that we respect the dignity of the act and of the other person. And so it's like we're trying to have our cake and eat it too. And in a culture that is mired in this sort of hedonistic self-gratification approach, we shouldn't be surprised to discover that people engage in hedonistic self-gratification like this and they fail to respect the dignity of other persons and treat them as little more than objects for their own gratification. And that's what's happened here. And then, of course, there's the bigger question of, well, what exactly has happened here? Because the reporting, I'm still a little bit unclear about what was found on his phone. I mean, despite the fact they've given descriptions of certain things that are, filming people undressing and things. But what does that actually mean? Was this criminal offending? Because if it was, holy moly, why haven't the police prosecuted? Or is this some sort of deviant perversion playing itself out where he's paid people to do this and he sat outside and filmed it? Like, it's just not clear what's gone on here. It's very troubling.
Yeah, I certainly don't have any details beyond what we've read. My limited take on it is there probably isn't anything illegal. The police aren't pressing charges, but how society, I think, rightly reacts. I mean, this is terrible behaviour. And yet, as you say, in a hedonistic society that says anything goes, then all of a sudden they find moral outrage in this space. But it also sits, I don't know, it's as much a comment from me, but feel free to add your own thoughts. Like, Nationals had a bit of trouble in this regard over many years. This is not the first, in this case, staff or MP. We can think of Jake Bezant, Andrew Falloon. There's a whole list of MPs who have been up to some absolutely appalling behaviour. I mean, as someone who observes politics but's not directly in it, do you think there's a cultural problem within the political party, the likes of National?
Well, I think it's the age-old human problem. Probably power is one of those things people love, and when you get close to power, often accountability goes out the window. And if you have a lack of virtue or certain vices in your life, they're probably going to amplify in that kind of environment. So that's probably a factor. But let's also be clear, the other parties as well. Labour has been no stranger to, behaviours that are absolutely reprehensible. One thing I will say in this case is I think it seems pretty clear, despite the fact that it was proposed as a resignation, that it's probably almost certain that the Prime Minister has said you've got to go. And it seems to have been handled pretty quickly. I contrast this with the Kitty Allen scandal.
Oh, yeah.
And I don't think that's very opposite of how you would handle this kind of thing. So yeah, it's that aspect of it. It's a positive that, and it sounds like if we are to believe what he said, this is something that might have been sort of some months ago, and he's been receiving therapy for some months, which would be good, because it does strike me as some form of sexual addiction that we are seeing manifesting here. But again, you're right, that point. The moral outrage only makes sense if there is something truly unique, morally speaking, like sex has its own moral character that is unique and sacred, which is what the Christian vision of reality says. Because, imagine if he just filmed, I don't know, people at the gym just doing gym workouts or something like that in a non-sexual way. No one would say, oh, what's that doing on his phone? But the fact that there's a sexual component speaks to the fact that sex does have its own moral character, and you don't do the same things that you might do in other situations. But the society we're living in doesn't really want to acknowledge that. It wants to pretend that isn't true.
No, and that's where those pretenses fall away in moments like this. I said I was going to be not throwing mud around, we're just, talking frankly and honestly on various political parties, but I wanted to get your quick take on the Maori Party. Obviously, they had the noose in Parliament recently. Their use of their language is getting, I would argue, increasingly violent. A few months ago during the hikoi, we had banners like this with, again, guns and so forth. I mean, again, it's a simple question, but a large one. I mean, are we seeing, from your point of view, and it may be with the Maori Party in particular, but within our parliamentary debate, sort of a greater openness, if not a call to violence in a way we haven't seen before?
Well, to me, there's two issues here. One thing that's really glaring is the double standard, because incidents like this don't really attract certainly the same media outrage, you'd have to say, but probably from the more progressive commentariat, they don't seem to be particularly disturbed by this. Another example would have been that incident with the guillotine some years ago. I think it was in Aotea Square. They had a protest where they had the Prime Minister and other ministers. They had a fake guillotine and a dummy, and they had their photocopies of their photos of their faces stuck on them, and they were beheading them. And that didn't attract much attention. But then when you have protesters at the parliamentary protest who make a gallows and have that kind of a conversation, that's the worst thing ever our democracy's seen, and it's dangerous and it's evil, and they want to kill people, and we should take this seriously. So there's a bit of a double standard here. However, I'm also a little bit conflicted, and I'll tell you why. I come from Irish heritage, and in many ways we're a little bit like the Maori people. We love our hyperbole, and we really, particularly probably directed towards the English crown as well. And I can imagine your average English person seeing a Celtic person turn up and express themselves quite forcefully, as we are wont to do, and they'd be quite shocked. Oh my gosh, Deirdre, did you hear what the savages are saying? And we're very similar. We turn up to war with our painted faces because we take our ancestors with us. That's a Celtic tradition. So there's a lot of, I think, a use of hyperbole here that, for me, I perhaps don't get as agitated by. However, on the other side of that, there is also, I think, an important dignity in the public life and a certain virtue that must be maintained and a certain prudence. So you might think that your hyperbole isn't that big a deal because you would never follow through on this. However, if it becomes a habitual pattern in our public life, there is a degrading that's going on of our public life, and virtue is being lost. Secondly, there's conceivably other people behind you who don't have the same self-control and who are going to read your hyperbole as permission to do things that are truly horrific to others. And so that's why, particularly I think when you're in a public service role like this, you've got to be very careful. I'm not saying that there aren't moments where that hyperbole isn't actually an appropriate and called for kind of thing, and it has an impact that matters. But if it's becoming a pattern, I don't think that is good for the public life, the loss of virtue. And B, I also would want to know, why is it a pattern? I find that hyperbole has impact when you use it once. But is it a pattern because you don't have much else to say? Everything you do is reactionary and there's not much more going on there. Is that why this is a pattern?
Yeah, I mean, look, my thoughts are very similar to yours. I mean, the Maori Party know that they get headlines by doing this, the more and more outrageous. But I really like and would really want to underline, particularly to our viewers, what you were saying, that as I understood it, the more they do this, it does give other people permission to go, oh, this should be the normal way of doing things. And it's just, degrading. Jumping topics, because again, there's so many. This is sort of a foreign affairs one, and it came out yesterday to do with Israel because, the government's come out and they're saying sanctioned, which is not quite true because New Zealand can't sanction anyone except Russians and Belarusians. But it put a travel ban on two Israeli ministers who, they're ultra-nationalists, I have to say. I find their views offensive, crazy. I certainly don't resonate with it, but these are ministers of the Israeli government who have been banned coming to New Zealand. I mean, do you see this as appropriate? Is it well within the realm of what New Zealand can do, or has Winston Peters and the government overreacted here?
Well, when you look at the history of these guys, particularly, I think it's pronounced Ben Gvir, is I think one of the gentlemen. He has some very serious extremism. In fact, his start in politics was he was associated with that ultra-Jewish supremacist group that assassinated, who was it? Netanyahu, wasn't it, who was killed by them. Now, he's not linked directly to the assassination, but he was part of that group. That was his start. He had for many years, and up until very recently where he says he's taken it down, he had a portrait of a man called Baruch Goldstein, who was a Jewish terrorist who killed 29 Palestinian worshippers in Hebron in the 90s. And he had his portrait up in his lounge. So this is a very extreme character. I think the Israeli state, in fact, has charged him something like more than 40 times for these kind of incidents. So, this is someone who's really on the extremes here. Both men are. The thing I wonder about, though, is what is the point of this? I get the sense that sometimes in international relations you join with your allies, but it feels to me that even when you're doing that, you should have a moral consistency in what you do. So if you do it in one area for one nation, surely you should do it for all nations. And secondly, I'm a big fan of, okay, well, what is the appropriate response of our nation? And I feel sometimes New Zealand, particularly of late, has just been dragged along by bigger nations and pulled into these kind of ventures. But there's not really much substance, and it can feel too much like virtue signaling. In this case, these two gentlemen are extreme, but I wonder, had they planned to visit New Zealand? Was there some reason to do this? I don't know. Is it just an act of political solidarity with allies or something like that?
Yeah, my take on it is, look, I find their backgrounds despicable, what they've done, said, how they celebrate. I suppose part of me goes, they're government ministers for a country we have full diplomatic relationships with, and I'm deeply uncomfortable with, in this case, banning their travel. I think it is a lot of virtue signalling. I think there's actually a debate coming up in the UN as we speak, and so I think New Zealand's rather chaotic foreign policy, where one moment it says one thing and next minute we're over with this group, it is coming through. So I think the virtue signalling's a big part of it. It's coming with a bit of a reaction. This is Marco Rubio, who've actually worked with over the years with the China question, but he's been saying to New Zealand, hey, well, what are you doing, along with the other countries? So it's coming with a bit of a reaction. But as I say, not wanting to defend these two, they don't seem like very nice people at all. But, for where I'm coming from, I'm always a bit concerned when we,
it feels to me too like you're I don't know. I guess it's one of those things. It's a judgment, it's a margin call possibly, but there is that idea traditionally when we understood. Now we operate in the post-World War II liberal consensus where we think it's all about soft power. That is clearly breaking down right now, and we're going back to what has traditionally been the norm, which is hard power. And traditionally, you would just deal with hard powers and accept these things. I mean, to the point whereby we, as part of the Allies, allied ourselves with one of the most atrocious monsters of the last 100 years in Stalin. And so it just seems sort of to me that maybe there is, like you've said here, there is an argument that I think is often made in international relations that diplomacy can actually be quite an important vehicle for dealing with the extremism of people in these situations. And so was it really thought through properly, I guess, as you've said, is the right question to ask.
Well, I also see it as inconsistent, and I'll just put up a couple of quick images for me, it's just my take on it. New Zealand deals with this guy, who heads, granted he's the president, but people know my views really clearly on, the constant and ongoing human rights abuses of China, but we don't sanction any of their ministers. This is the Prime Minister, Brendan, of Qatar. So it was all smiles and handshakes a few months ago. But, Qatar is involved in all sorts of, again, human rights abuses and support of a terrorist group. But New Zealand welcomes them in. So for me, again, it's that consistency issue. Because, many of these political actors aren't, they're not saints. But I'm just struck, and it's probably one of my key frustrations in the decision, that New Zealand turns a blind eye to the Qataris, to China and others. This is, by the way, this is a Tibetan I met in Tokyo. She was in prison, young woman, for 3 years for wearing Tibetan dress and praising the Dalai Lama, and yet we allow ministers from that government, the Chinese government, to come in. So it's just, again, it's that arbitrary nature of how New Zealand seems to decide things. I'm just going to stop there for us for a moment and just put a short ad break on, just to let people know about our forum on the family. It also gives Brendan and I a quick chance to have a glass of water, but we'll be back soon.
The Forum on the Family is one of the premier family conferences held each year with international and national speakers and political leaders. Hosted by Family First New Zealand, the Forum brings together a national network of family-focused organisations, scholars, lobby groups, church leaders and community groups who are part of a growing movement to bring New Zealand to a point where families are strengthened, marriage is honoured, life is protected and religious freedom is defended. This year's conference will again be held at the Dewdrop Event Centre in Manukau City, not too far from the Auckland Airport, on Thursday 28th of August and Friday 29th of August. Yes, because of demand, we're starting the conference earlier with 3 important sessions and a time of networking on the Thursday evening, and then a full-day program all day Friday. This year's theme is Courage at a Cultural Tipping Point. The culture is slowly but surely waking up to the harmful effects of the radical left-wing agenda and the destruction of family values that we all hold dear. Some countries have even figured out how to define a woman. And at this year's conference, once again, we have an amazing lineup of brave speakers from the US, Canada, Australia and New Zealand. Dr. Miriam Grossman last spoke at our forum in 2012. You may also recognise her from the recent Daily Wire documentary, What is a Woman? But more recently, she's released an important book on the transgender agenda. I'll be doing a live interview with Dr. Grossman from New York, where she is based. Jeff Johnson is an issues analyst for Focus on the Family in the United States. We're also very excited to have Dawn Hawkins discussing the issue of pornography and sexual exploitation. From Canada, we have Amanda Ackman bringing us a warning about the slippery slope of euthanasia. From Australia, we have Kirralie Smith, a wife, a mother, and an activist for biology and truth, but who is paying the price for speaking up. And for the first time in New Zealand, you will get to hear their side of the story. Israel and Maria Folau. Now, we're hoping that they'll be able to attend in person. They're keen to be here, but it does depend on Israel's rugby schedule in Japan. But either way, we'll get to hear from them personally and not via the hostile mainstream media. And finally, we're hosting and recording a special episode of Straight Talk before a live audience at the conference. It'll be a lively discussion and you can be part of that live audience. I want to invite you to this year's Forum on the Family. It starts Thursday night, 28th, 6 p.m. to 9:30 p.m. and then all day Friday, 29th from 8:45 a.m. through to 4:30 p.m. It's the highlight of the year and you don't want to miss it. Arrange to be there. Book your flights today. Gather your friends. If you're concerned for our culture, our country and our families, you may be saying, what can I do? Well, step 1, attend the Forum on the Family. Have your spine stiffened by some fabulous speakers who will encourage, equip and inspire you. Now, the last couple of years have been sellouts, so don't delay. Go to our website, forumonthefamily.nz, for all the information you need. Register today. Don't miss this important family conference. Go to forumonthefamily.nz. Register today.
Well, there's your dose of Bob, everyone. But jokes aside, come in the 10 forum on the family. As I say, it sells out every year, and we'd love to have you all along. Brendan, last couple of topics, actually moving into the life space, so to do with hospices and to do with actually euthanasia and tikanga. So I'll put up a couple of shots. First and foremost, and this will probably be relatively quick, does it surprise you just how bad the state of our hospices are, and why is the government not reacting at all, it seems to be?
Well, yeah, it is really, really troubling, especially if you're going to try and claim that people have choice now in regards to euthanasia and assisted suicide on the table as well. What was interesting, I thought, in this latest article about this was that the Minister of Health, Simeon Brown, has clearly signalled that the government is not in opposition to this. It seems to be the Ministry of Health is not allocating funding that he's stated in this article that they actually have and should be allocating to that. And I think what's even more troubling for me in light of this is that for some years now over in Canada, they have been producing public reports, like government reports, that literally will state how much money can be saved with euthanasia. And so what we've got is this problem now of an increasing aging population and not enough babies coming through who have been born who are actually going to contribute and ensure that our healthcare system can continue to be maintained to the same standard. And so there's a huge burden there. And if you're a bean counter, the sad reality is that you look at something like palliative care and you think, well, that's quite costly, but contrasted with euthanasia, it's not. And so I think there's just the care that should be here is not here. And even before euthanasia was legalized, like the fact that hospices have to fundraise a half of their annual budget, this is not a good look for a supposedly first world nation, it seems to me. In fact, I would argue probably developing nations treat their elderly members a lot better than what we do in this regard.
I've actually got a podcast coming up with Marianne Spurtle soon around this too, and you've touched on the key point at the start, is you can't argue there's end-of-life choice when all you have is fully funded euthanasia and assisted suicide and a very underfunded palliative care system. But the other element coming through, and it's also coming through the Ministry of Health's reports, is how tikanga, look, I don't presume to be an expert in Māori tikanga, but generally speaking, certainly when I sat on the select committee, Brendan, a lot of Māori are saying, look, this is not part of our culture. But we're beginning to see now the warping of tikanga to try and accept this. And actually the Ministry of Health's own document, its review document, says, oh, look, many Māori in Pacifica don't accept euthanasia and assisted suicide. And so basically we're going to berate them, send them into struggle sessions over time effectively, and for them to change their mind. They have to change their tikanga. I mean, is this just another example of how accepting euthanasia and assisted suicide warps the moral fabric, in this case the cultural fabric of a people?
Well, there was so much perverse irony even in this article and what was going on here. I think there was a very powerful foreshadowing about this problem right back during the debate, and some who were observers of that debate, like I was, and obviously you as well, Simon, will remember that Willie Jackson got up and gave a speech and talked about tikanga, and he talked about his own mother, who was very resistant and would not have approved at all. And then he went on to talk about, well, in actual fact, tikanga can be what you want it to be. And that's really what we're seeing here, which is troubling, because then in other situations you'll hear the references to tikanga as if it's an objective set of principles that can't be violated. So that's an irony in and of itself. But then there's also the other problem here, and that what I see here is, if you're going to talk about colonization and colonialism, this is a colonial construct being imposed upon an Indigenous people here. And many of people from that Indigenous group have said this is not our way. And despite that fact, it's being imposed upon us. Yet at the end of the article, we have someone claiming that a stigma around euthanasia is actually a colonial imposition upon the Māori people. Like, I can't help but sense the great tragedy and the darkness in this, because Māori people have some of the worst outcomes in the healthcare system. And it's not to their advantage to have euthanasia pushed into their communities, because what it will become is a convenient way of not addressing those serious social issues around the healthcare system, and particularly the disparities we often see between what Māori are able to access. And so there's already an issue with palliative care around the country. They call it the postcode lottery. And if you're in the right postcode, it's well funded. If you're not in the right postcode, there's not as many resources available to you. And you don't need to be a rocket scientist to realize that a lot of Māori communities will be in those places where they are not receiving that proper care. And so the last thing you need is the insertion of euthanasia into those communities.
It also, for me, well, 2 points amongst many. I remember actually giving a speech in the Parliament around tikanga, how at one moment it's sort of set in concrete, and the next moment it's completely fluid, depending on what suited people. And it's like, well, hold on, which one is it here? But the second element too is, again, just how it clashes with, the notions of whakapapa, for example, so deeply important. And yet here we have, not just in that article, I think it was on One News, but in that Ministry of Health report saying, well, basically, you have to change. In this case, Māoridom, Pacifica communities, everyone, and same with, religious communities, you're going to have to change. I'm going to do all that we can. I suspect, Brendan, they'll find a lot of money, not for more palliative care, but to try and convert us all into their way of their thinking.
Well,
Brendan,
Simon, did you see too in that article the reference to what is literally they're describing like a state-sanctioned ritualized religious killing where they pray over the needles and they pray before and after they inject the person, and that's what it is. It's a religious killing ritual. It's really what happened to separation of religion and the state. All of a sudden, that doesn't mean anything now.
Well, I mean, again, this is another tangent that you and I could spend hours talking about, but the notion of praying over the tools of death make absolutely no sense whatsoever. Certainly to a Christian mindset, it's anathema. It just
no.
But again, for me, that shows that the perverted nature of what's being put forward here. I mean, it's crazy. Hey, let's end on a high, so to speak. Not because we've been talking about pharmaceutical products and needles. Very bad segue.
Not a Green Party guy.
That's right. We haven't actually talked about the Green Party today, but that's all right. Let's talk about you. And you work very strongly in many spaces, but certainly in the pro-life space. So talk us through Activate and what you're doing, not only this training weekend, but talk us through Activate.
Oh, I love this program. I was privileged with a couple of other people to actually found Activate, the pro-life training program. We're 14 years ago now here in New Zealand, and also often regularly repeated in Australia as well. And it's been happening every year since, bar that little incident with COVID where we all couldn't go anywhere. But basically what we've got now is we've got twice a year we hold an event. We've got our first one coming up in the start of July, which is a youth camp for 16 to 25-year-olds. That's almost full. We've only got about 4 or 5 spaces left. So that's a really hopeful sign. And then in August in Auckland, we have a bit more of an in-depth session or training event that's aimed at 18-year-old plus people. So anyone who's 18 plus can attend that event, and it's the Pro-Life Training Week. And it's really in depth. We have, I mean, you'll be coming to speak about politics, Simon, among many other guest speakers.
Don't put people off.
Yeah. If that doesn't suit you, we can find someone else, folks. But no, it's always good. And we also have a host of other guest speakers, and obviously I present sessions, and we really go deep and we talk about the philosophy of our current culture. We don't just talk about the ethical fruit that we're seeing, like with abortion and euthanasia. We talk about the philosophies which have given rise to that particular fruit. And then more importantly, what can we do to actually make a difference? Because there is actually some powerful things we can do. We don't need to sit in despair. There are things we can do. And so it's been a very fruitful event. As I said, 14 years, a lot of good fruit. A lot of people have been through the program over the years. And a lot of people consistently tell us that one thing that was a big experience for them was they came into the event feeling sort of hopeless and like it was just too big of a problem to solve, and they didn't know what to do or where to start. And coming out the other side, they realized, wow, actually, even in my own family life, I can begin to rebuild the culture of life. And so, I can't commend it enough. ActivateNZ.org if you want to know more. We've still got plenty of spaces at the Pro-Life Training Week for anyone who's 18 plus coming up in Auckland.
I can just highly recommend it to viewers and listeners. I mean, Brendan does an amazing job. I can't recommend it highly enough, and it's conveniently around the same time as the Forum on the Family, which is also in Auckland. So attend both. We're not giving a double discount, but come along and engage. Brendan, incredibly grateful for your time as always. We'll find out next week whether you've usurped and supplanted Bob.
Gosh, I don't expect high ratings. I mean, Bob, he's one of a kind.
He is. No, we miss you, Bob, but we are pleased you're having a break. Look, to everyone who's been online across all the platforms, and for all those commenting, certainly the ones that we're getting here live, you've delightfully overwhelmed me. I can see them all. Thank you for all your comments and questions. They are appreciated. That's Political Playback for another week. We'll be back next Thursday at 5 p.m. But of course, there's all the other Family First shows, so stay tuned. And again, to you, Brendan, really appreciative of you coming on and sharing your insights. So have a great night.
Thank you. Mate wai, everyone.